They thought the old Mustang was just a leftover from gentler days, half blind, half lame, more memory than muscle. But that evening, when a wounded woman collapsed under the fist of her own son, something ancient and wild surged up inside the horse. No one had ever seen Rusty move like that. No one imagined what he was capable of. And in that instant, between violence and silence, he made a choice that would echo through the lives of 3 generations. What followed wasn't instinct. It wasn't training. It was something far greater. And it changed everything. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The last sun of summer hung low over the hills of Appalachia, stretching long bruised rays across the browned grass and thirsty woods. Evening crept down Walker Hollow Ranch like a heavy blanket, warm, thick, and oddly still. The air was motionless, not a leaf on the big maples or oaks so much as fluttered. Insects hummed, cicadas rattling in the branches, and chickens scratching and fussing along the edge of the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a pair of blue jays bickered over a patch of wild blackberries, their calls barely carrying above the gentle clatter of the hens. Walker Hollow Ranch sat in a shallow valley carved between 2 green, time-worn hills, nothing more than a faded relic with its sun-bleached wood fences, cracked stone well, and a yard where the gravel had long ago surrendered to patches of tough grass and packed red dirt. If you stood still and listened, it felt as if time itself slowed here, holding its breath, the past still breathing somewhere beneath the dust. Near the house, Grace Walker was hunched in her vegetable patch hands, deep in the warm soil. At 68, she wore her silver hair pulled back in a tidy braid that hung along her neck, her face lined and tanned by decades of sun. Her eyes, gray sharp and watchful, carried the weight of stories unspoken. Her right leg dragged as she knelt or rose, the legacy of a mortar blast in Afghanistan, nearly 2 decades past. Sometimes the ache flared so sharply, it made her gasp. But she had learned to live with the pain, as she'd learned to live with most things, by refusing to let it have the last word. Grace had come back to Walker Hollow after her last deployment, turning her back on a world that no longer made sense, and pouring herself into the earth, planting rows of lima beans, tomatoes, and whatever else the stubborn soil would let grow. There was a certain peace in it, the repetition of digging and weeding, the hush of dusk coming on. She would pause from time to time to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of a calloused hand gaze fixed on the far ridge, as if searching for something no one else could see. A pale scar ran from her left temple to the angle of her jaw, puckered and shiny, always there in the edge of her reflection, silent evidence of things she never spoke about. Not far off, her grandson, Jack Jr., was the very image of youthful wildness, 10 years old, skinny as a beanpole with brown hair that stuck up in every direction and a faded t-shirt emblazoned with a once bright star. His feet were bare and dirty, scuffed from chasing a saggy old rubber ball that bounced listlessly over the cracked earth. As he dribbled and kicked, a dark brown Mustang followed him at a slow, patient walk, Rusty, the old gelding who had seen more of life than most humans ever would. Rusty had been born on the ranch in better days, back when Jack's father Ethan was a boy not much older than Jack was now. Time and trouble had left their marks. The horse's coat had dulled to the color of strong coffee. His mane streaked with gray, his deep eyes wise and kind. Most days Rusty moved with a ponderous calm, pausing often to sniff the air or nibble at tufts of grass. But to Jack, the Mustang was more than just an animal. He was a confidant, a fellow dreamer. Jack spent hours talking to Rusty about school secrets or the stories he read aloud from dog-eared library books. Sometimes in the soft golden light, the pair looked less like boy and horse and more like 2 old souls who had known each other forever. This too was a ritual each afternoon as the sun began to drop. Grace would work her garden, Jack would play, and Rusty would circle the yard, never straying far. The house was not filled with conversation, but with gentle, companionable silences, the kind that spoke of trust and understanding beyond words. Yet, in the hush that settled over them, and there was always a faint echo the name of the father who had never come back, the empty place at the table. The questions Jack still carried, but never quite dared to ask. Sometimes Grace would close her eyes while kneeling among the rows of tomatoes, breathing slow and deep. Jack thought she was just tired, but in truth, she was remembering how to draw breath in a world that had once been shattered by gunfire and fear. Even in this quiet place, the shadows of old battles lingered. Then one late afternoon, as cicadas sang and the first stars pressed pale against the dimming sky, something changed. A low rumble trembled up the dirt lane, the unmistakable growl of an engine grinding over the rocks. Jack froze in mid-kick. Rusty's ears flicked up, eyes sharp, body going taut and alert. Grace, who had been pulling weeds from under the okra, looked up, her features tensing. The sound grew louder, drawing the attention of every living thing on the ranch. Over the rise, a battered white pickup appeared, caked in dust, its grille dented, and one headlight foggy with age. It crawled up the rutted track wheels, spinning over stones, trailing a plume of red earth behind it. The cab seemed to glint for a moment in the fading sun, making it hard to see who sat behind the wheel. Jack's hand stilled on his ball. Rusty took a step toward the fence, snorting, his old instincts rising. Grace wiped her palms on her pants and stood slow and stiff, as if bracing herself for a blow. Her gaze never left the pickup as it shuddered to a stop by the front gate. She recognized the shape of it before she saw the face, recognized the familiar pattern in the way the door slammed, a single angry sound that split the evening calm. Some part of her, deep and old, had been waiting for this. She drew a breath, squared her shoulders, and watched as the past came climbing up the drive, trailing dust and memories behind it. The moment hung quiet, heavy, electric, with the tension of things about to break. Walker Hollow Ranch had seen plenty of storms, but this one, Grace knew, would not be weathered in silence. The white pickup had barely stopped moving when the door flung open with a sharp, final-sounding crack, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence Grace had dreaded for years. Ethan Walker stepped out, slow but purposeful, his tall frame filling the narrow space between the battered truck and the edge of the gravel drive. He was 45, though time and worry had carved him into someone older. Shoulders broad under a wrinkled shirt, faded jeans, boots scarred and dust-choked from too many miles. His face tanned by long days, and long walks wore the prickly stubble of someone who'd stopped caring about first impressions. His hair was clipped close on the sides, just a little longer, and unkempt on top, a compromise between army and freedom. The collar of his shirt hung open, and beneath it, his throat worked hard, as if swallowing back something hot. But it was his eyes, dark, unreadable, not red with tears, but stormy with old resentments that warned of trouble. As Ethan's boots hit the yard, it wasn't just ground he was stepping on, but the brittle crust of memory, the kind that never healed, no matter how many years or miles you tried to stack between then and now. For a moment, he just stood there, keys clenched in his fist. Then, with a slow exhale, he took in the old place, Walker Hollow Ranch, the shell of his boyhood. The fences were still there, grayer, missing more slats than he remembered. The barn roof sagged like an old back. The paddock gate hung askew, barely keeping the world out. Rusty, the Mustang he'd known since childhood, watched from under a scraggly oak coat caked with mud, mane wild. Ethan's mouth twisted in a crooked half smile, the kind that tasted bitter. "This is what you're still holding on to, huh, Mom?" he muttered under his breath. The word Mom was nearly a taunt, a challenge aimed at the woman standing alone in the garden patch. His gaze snagged on a rough wooden post by the porch, the one he'd once been chained to as punishment for breaking the fence with a stick. He remembered the feeling, the heat, the shame, the silent dare not to cry. Old anger licked its way up his spine. Grace didn't move as her son approached. She'd stood rooted in the same patch of earth dirt under her nails, sweat beading along the furrow of her brow. She made no effort to cross the yard, no call of welcome or relief. Instead, her gray eyes measured every inch of Ethan's approach, gratitude that he was alive, mixed with a wary tension that bristled like a warning wire. Her left hand hovered at her hip over the spot where shrapnel still ached with the weather, and she pressed it flat, not for the pain, but to brace herself for what might come. For a second, she considered speaking first. But what could she possibly say? She settled for the only words that felt honest, though they nearly stuck in her throat. "You're home," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer. He let his silence settle like a stone. For a heartbeat, there was only the low chorus of cicadas and the thunk of the pickup engine cooling in the sun. He swept his gaze around the yard, slow and appraising. The weeds along the fence, the listing barn, the patches of dirt where grass had given up. He let out a huff, half laugh, half snort. So little had changed, and yet the very sameness of it all made something in him bristle. His gaze paused for a long moment on that old post by the porch, and the one that had once meant discipline, humiliation, sometimes safety from his own chaos. The memory hit hard, stirring up the ghosts he'd thought he'd left behind when he first took the highway out of Walker Hollow. Just then, Jack Jr. darted around the corner, breathless, clutching his battered ball, oblivious to the charge in the air. The boy saw Ethan and froze mid-stride, the ball slipping from his fingers. He stared wide-eyed, uncertain, caught in the uncharted territory between child and stranger. Grace broke the tension. "Jack," she said, voice even, "this is your father." The words hung between them, heavy as iron. Jack blinked, nodding out of habit, his hands gripping the ball so tightly his knuckles went white. He shifted his weight, not sure if he was supposed to step forward or stay put. Ethan crouched down, forcing a smile, and tapped his faded baseball cap, a gesture that might have once been familiar, but now felt forced and foreign. His hand trembled ever so slightly, and the boy's eyes caught it. Jack didn't flinch, but there was something careful in his gaze. Not fear exactly, but a kind of instinctive calculation, the sense that a wild animal had walked into the yard. Jack's whole body seemed to shrink into himself as he waited, uncertain for what would happen next. "You've gotten bigger," Ethan managed the words, clumsy and flat. "He likes cornbread." Grace replied, her eyes never leaving Ethan's hands, as if she expected them to lash out, as if she'd learned long ago to watch the hands first. A silence stretched taut as a rope. Jack looked from his father to his grandmother, waiting for someone to explain the rules of this new world. But neither did. For a moment, it was just the three of them, each one holding something back, none willing to be the first to speak. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't come here to visit Mom," he said, finally his voice hard. "I came to say the things you never let me say." The sentence dropped like a stone into still water, sending invisible ripples through all of them. Grace's shoulders tensed, and Jack's eyes widened as if some silent alarm had been triggered that only he could hear. Without another word, Ethan turned and strode up the weathered steps of the porch, crossing the faded threshold with a kind of defiance, an act that wasn't quite permission, but couldn't be refused. Grace watched him go, spine-straight jaw, set her expression equal parts dread and resignation. Inside the house felt different, smaller, airless, full of dust and ghosts. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, pictures hung slightly askew. Ethan dropped his duffel by the hall table, the thud echoing in the empty space. Jack lingered in the doorway, ball clutched at his chest, eyes following his father's every move. Grace didn't follow Ethan in. She paused at the foot of the steps, kneeling to pick a stray weed from between the porch boards, her hands working with deliberate care. She heard Ethan's boots on the floorboards, heard him open the fridge, slam it shut again, heard the exhale, half growl, half sigh that was so familiar from years ago. For a while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the old house and the echo of things not said. Out in the yard, Rusty shook his head and snorted as if sensing the old storm brewing again. In the kitchen, Ethan stared out the window at the backyard, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, seeing not what was there, but everything he wished he could forget. And in the silence that followed, it was clear that the peace of Walker Hollow had just been shattered. And the questions no one wanted to answer would not wait another day. The wooden kitchen of Walker Hollow Ranch had always felt like the safest room in the house. It was built from thick pine, darkened with years, and memories the kind of place where the world outside war drought laws could sometimes be kept at bay for a while. A faded cotton curtain hung in the window, filtering the sharp golden rays of the late afternoon sun. The air was heavy with the scent of stewing beans, a handful of wild thyme, and the faintest undercurrent of wood smoke from the old iron stove. Grace stood at the stove, her back to the room, stirring a heavy pot of beans. It wasn't hunger that kept her moving. It was the need to keep her hands busy to keep them from shaking. Her shoulders were stiff. Her hair, silver and fine, had slipped from its braid and clung to her damp neck. She focused on the circle her wooden spoon made, as if she could stir herself away from this moment and into a different life. Ethan sat across the small kitchen table from her, leaning back just enough to seem casual. But his eyes were alert, searching, scanning, picking at details like he was looking for flaws. The wood groaned beneath him. His fingers drummed lightly, tracing knots and scratches that had outlasted decades of family. Silence stretched between them, thick and brittle. Ethan was the first to break it, voice quiet but as sharp as broken glass. You chose the Army. You chose this ranch. You chose everything, Mom, except me. Grace didn't turn. She kept stirring, but her knuckles whitened on the spoon. Ethan's words weren't loud, but they cut deep. You left when I was in second grade. You packed me off to Aunt Maggie's like I was a package to be delivered. You called every few months just to check if I was breathing. He picked up his glass, took a measured sip of water, and then set it down hard enough to rattle. He looked at her eyes, hard jaws set. I can't even remember your voice, Grace. Do you know what that feels like? For a moment, the only reply was the soft bubbling of the beans. Then slowly, Grace set down her spoon. She straightened as much as she could manage, favoring her injured leg, and faced him. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but jagged, full of the cracks left by battles inside and out. I didn't choose to leave you. I chose to survive, she said. Your father left me here with a broken ranch, a baby, and 2 empty hands. Do you really think I wanted war? I chose the Army because at least there we could eat. At least there I had a roof. I sent you to Maggie because if I hadn't, her voice faltered, I wasn't sure I could keep us both alive. Ethan shook his head, half laugh, half snarl. Survive. And what does surviving mean to you? You came back, but you never looked for me. Not once. You didn't show up at school. Not for my 10th birthday. Not for my 15th. Not for graduation. His voice rose sharper now, as if the words had been waiting for years to break free. I thought you were dead, Grace. Then I saw you in the newspaper Veterans Honor Day. There you were standing, straight medals shining, not a mention that you even had a son named Ethan. You looked like you never missed a thing. Grace lowered her head, shoulders trembling ever so slightly. She didn't cry, not openly. She hadn't allowed herself that luxury in years. Ethan clenched his fists, pushed back from the table, and stood. Aunt Maggie was kind. But I didn't want her kindness. I wanted my mother. I wanted a hug. I wanted someone to tell me what to do or just ask if I was okay just once. The kitchen shrank around them walls, creaking with the weight of what had never been said. Behind the doorframe, Jack stood with his old rubber ball in hand, half hidden by the wall. He didn't know what graduation meant, or why his father's voice shook, or what PTSD stood for. But he understood the way the room vibrated with something, breaking the way his grandmother's hands trembled as she sat, the way his father's words cut the air like an axe. He blinked, trying not to cry, but something in his chest hurt. He felt like a window pane, thin and cold, with a storm beating on both sides. Grace lowered herself into a chair across from Ethan. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Every joint ached with memory. She spoke softly, almost whispering, her hands folded on the table. "I didn't know any other way, Ethan. Maybe you'll never believe this, but I wrote you letters every year." Ethan stared at her, brow furrowed. What letters? She looked away. Letters I never sent. I didn't have the courage. I was afraid you'd read them and think I was weak. Afraid it would hurt you more, not less. I thought, maybe you'd live better if you didn't have to remember me at all. Ethan was silent for a long time. The anger in his eyes softened just for a second into something else, something more lost than furious. He drew a shaky breath, bracing his arms on the table. "You know what I remember about falling as a kid? I never cried because I was hurt. I cried because there was nobody to pick me up." Grace placed her hand on the table inches from his. She didn't reach for him, but she didn't pull away either. The tension in the wooden kitchen grew so dense, it was like trying to breathe water. Heat from the old iron stove mixed with the bitterness swirling between mother and son, and even the scent of simmering beans couldn't soften the air. Grace clung to the rhythm of stirring her face, turned away, willing her voice to stay even. But her eyes, always so strong, betrayed her wet and shining in the late sun. Ethan saw it, and it only made him angrier. "Don't you dare pity me," he snapped, voice suddenly raw and loud. "You don't get to cry, not when you're the one who left me behind." His hand came down hard on the table, sending the glass of water shattering onto the wood shards, scattering across the floor. The sharp sound ricocheted through the house, a warning shot that echoed in every corner. Before Grace could step back, Ethan's anger boiled over. In one lurching movement, he surged forward and shoved her hard on the shoulder. Grace stumbled, catching the corner of the old kitchen table with her hip before collapsing onto the boards. The impact rang out, a dull, ugly thud that seemed to tear a seam in the fabric of the evening. Time staggered and almost stopped. From the hall, a child's cry pierced the kitchen. "Dad, stop!" Jack's voice cracked in terror. He barreled in small feet, pounding the floor. His eyes were wide and wild cheeks flushed with panic. He flung himself forward, tiny hands grabbing the hem of Ethan's shirt, tugging hard, as if sheer force could pull his father back from the brink. "Don't hurt her," he pleaded, voice breaking. "Please, Dad." He looked at his grandmother, now lying on the floor, her hair disheveled, face red, where it had scraped the wood, her left arm shaking. Jack didn't understand the history or the meaning of what he'd just witnessed. But he understood enough something was horribly, terribly wrong. A new sound, sharp and alien, interrupted the chaos, a cracking, splintering snap from somewhere outside. For a second, nobody moved. Then came the heavy, thunderous pounding of hooves, a wooden gate slamming hard against the barn wall. And finally, a long, earth-shaking whinny that vibrated through the windows and right into their bones. All three froze. Grace sprawled on the floor, Ethan panting, Jack clutching his father's shirt. The kitchen, for one brief, dreamlike moment, was silent, save for the pounding of hearts. And then through the open back door and the swirling dust, Rusty appeared. The old Mustang burst through the yard like a storm made flesh muscles taut beneath a weathered hide mane, whipping in the windtail, streaming behind him like a flag. He moved faster than seemed possible for an animal, his age every step hammering the ground, sending little stones and clods of dirt flying. No one could later explain how Rusty had broken free from his stall. The latch lay splintered on the barn floor, but there was no sign of panic, just determination. He charged straight for the kitchen door, skidding to a halt inches from the steps. For a moment, he seemed to fill the whole frame, blocking out the sky with his sheer presence. Ethan, on instinct, backed away, hands raised half in defense, half in disbelief. But Rusty did not attack. Instead, he stepped forward, planting himself squarely between Grace and Ethan. He reared up forelegs, striking the air, and let out a whinny so loud it rattled the windows, a sound both ancient and commanding. A warning, a plea, a declaration. His eyes dark and deep, reflecting something older than memory, locked onto Ethan's. They were not angry, not wild, but steady and enormous, as if seeing past flesh and into the spirit itself. Ethan's fist, still clenched from moments before, began to tremble. Behind Rusty, Jack slid to the floor, wrapping his arms around his grandmother. He pressed his cheek to her shoulder, whispering, "I'm here, Grandma. I'm here." Grace, for a moment, could only stare up at the old Mustang. She saw not just an animal, but the memory of every moment she'd held on the loyalty that had never left the silent witness to her pain and hope. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The only sound was the crackling of beans boiling over on the stove, filling the air with the sharp scent of burning supper. Yet even the smoke seemed to hang back, as if unwilling to intrude on what was unfolding. Rusty stood like a sentinel, legs, square head held low, but not submissive, neck-arched ears, flicking to every breath and heartbeat in the room. His breathing came deep and steady, his sides rising and falling like bellows. He didn't stamp or prance. He simply occupied the space with such certainty that the world seemed to reorganize around him. He was at once the oldest thing on the ranch, and in this moment, the only thing that mattered. Jack, his face wet with silent tears, whispered Rusty's protecting grandma. He said it as a fact, not a question, spoken with the clarity of a child who knows that love is the most real thing in the world. Ethan, voice strained and hollow, tried to reclaim some sense of authority. "It's just instinct, kid," he rasped. "He sees things falling apart, he reacts." But as he said it, the words died in his throat. Even he could hear how little he believed it. He took a step back, retreating almost unconsciously. Rusty's gaze followed him, unblinking, implacable. In those eyes was something that made Ethan feel small, exposed, ashamed. He found himself shaking his head, voice dropping to a mumble. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he muttered, voice barely audible. "I didn't come here to do this." Grace braced herself on one elbow, pain burning through her hip. Jack clung to her, trying to help her up. Rusty's posture softened ever so slightly when he saw her move, but he remained a silent wall between the woman on the ground and the man who had knocked her there. For a long moment, the kitchen remained frozen. Ethan stood, fists at his side, breathing hard, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Grace, still on the floor, finally managed to sit up, wincing as she did. Jack's arms held her steady. Rusty never wavered, his job in his mind unfinished. The air thickened with expectation, the sun cutting hard angles across the old pine floor. It was as if the ranch itself was holding its breath. Grace slowly reached out her hand, trembling, and rested her palm on Rusty's warm, sturdy neck. The Mustang responded, lowering his head, exhaling a long, rumbling sigh that seemed to empty the kitchen of tension. In that moment, the old horse was more than an animal. He was a barrier, a shield, a living rebuke, and a vessel of forgiveness all at once. "It's all right, old friend," she whispered, voice cracking. "I'm okay." Rusty remained still for another moment, then snorted softly, the sound vibrating in Jack's chest. His eyes flicked from Grace to Jack, and then finally back to Ethan. Jack looked up at his father, his voice soft, but ringing with quiet certainty. "I think he knows when to stand in the middle." Ethan didn't answer. He looked away, blinking hard. For the first time since he'd set foot on the ranch, there were tears in his eyes, not from rage or frustration, but from a well of grief he'd spent half a lifetime trying to cap. The silence held, but it was a different kind of silence now. No longer a void of things unsaid, but a fragile, uneasy peace. Grace slowly, painfully, got to her feet. Jack kept one arm wrapped around her waist, the other gently stroking Rusty's mane. The Mustang let the touch happen, ears flicking back and forth, content for now to remain between worlds, between violence and forgiveness. Ethan backed toward the door, hands at his sides. He paused, studying Rusty, as if seeing him for the first time. In those dark, unwavering eyes, Ethan read a kind of judgment he could not escape. But he also saw understanding, a reminder that even in the deepest anger, there is a chance for grace. "I'm sorry," he said at last, a voice hoarse. "I'm so goddamn sorry." He turned away, stepping out onto the porch. The air outside was cool and heavy with dusk. His breath came ragged as he leaned against a post, and the muscles in his neck tense and trembling. Inside, Grace and Jack stayed close. Rusty still a solid presence between them. The kitchen, with its broken glass and scorched beans, felt less like a battleground now, and more like a place where something holy had happened. Grace brushed a lock of hair from Jack's face and pressed a shaky kiss to his forehead. "We're all right, sweetheart," she murmured. Jack nodded, eyes still wide, but calmer now. He glanced up at Rusty, who nickered softly as if in response. For a while, no one spoke. The sun dipped behind the ridge shadows, growing long and blue across the ranch. A gentle breeze drifted through the open kitchen door, carrying the scent of cut grass and the last lingering heat of the day. In that hush, a kind of healing began, a first tentative step back from the edge. They all knew the path ahead would not be easy, nor free from scars. But in that kitchen, with a Mustang standing guard and forgiveness trembling in the air, the world seemed for the first time in a long time like a place where hope could take root. Rusty, satisfied, finally stepped back, letting Grace and Jack close the distance between them. Grace leaned on her cane, her body sore, but her heart strangely light. She smiled at Jack and then at Rusty, gratitude radiating from her tired eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she meant it for the horse, the boy, or the mercy of another chance. Night rose over the Appalachian hills, cold and impossibly quiet. The moon, a silver coin high above the ridge, spilled a pale spectral light across the slopes and hollows. Walker Hollow Ranch seemed to sink into itself, the barn and the old farmhouse crouching under the weight of a silence thicker than wool. Even the chorus of cicadas had ceased, as if the whole world were holding its breath. The trees stood motionless, their leaves black against the sky. Not a dog barked. Not a single chicken muttered from its coop. The only sound was the occasional sigh of a breeze threading its way through the upper branches of the old oak behind the barn, stirring the memory of 1,000 forgotten summers. Inside the house, Jack lay in his narrow bed, already deep in sleep. His arms curled around a threadbare teddy bear, one ear chewed and half of its stuffing long since lost. In his other hand, he still gripped the open pages of a book, a story about a horse, the words blurring into the dreamscape behind his eyelids. His breathing was even untroubled, untouched by the storms that swept through the waking world. On the porch, Grace sat in her favorite wooden chair, and the one that creaked in all the right ways. She wore an old flannel shirt over her nightgown and had propped her aching legs on a battered footstool. Her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea forgotten as soon as the warmth had faded. Her eyes silvered by age, and memory scanned the horizon, searching for something only she knew how to name. The night pressed in on her, and still she waited quiet alert, bracing herself for the return of whatever unfinished business still haunted this place. It happened suddenly, as these things often do. A wild, unearthly whinny split the hush, echoing out of the trees that wreathed the back pasture in fog. It wasn't the cry of pain or fear, but something else, older, deeper, a voice calling from the edge of the world. Grace jerked upright, the mug tumbling from her lap and striking the porch with a muffled thud. The sound seemed almost sacrilegious in the velvet dark. She listened, heart racing, as the call lingered, fading slowly into the woods. It hadn't come from the barn or the paddock, but from beyond, somewhere deeper in the wild, where the land sloped up and the mist moved in silent sheets. She felt it in her bones. This was no ordinary horse's voice, but a summons from the old, sacred places. In the stable, Rusty woke from his half-sleep, his ears pricked, muscles tensing beneath his russet hide. For a moment, he stood utterly still, as if every part of him was listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a low, deliberate exhale, he lifted his head high and turned toward the window that faced the forest. His eyes, wide, solemn, shone with reflected moonlight. He did not tremble. He was not afraid. Instead, he seemed to be standing at attention, as if he recognized the sound and honored it. Rusty answered. His whinny was brief and quiet, but rich with meaning, vibrating deep in his chest before rising to join the night. If the forest was a cathedral, this was his prayer. Out by the kitchen steps, Ethan sat in the dark, elbows on his knees, cigarette burning low between two fingers. He'd been nursing the silence, letting it soak into his bones, trying to find some peace at the edge of exhaustion. When Rusty's call cut through the quiet, he looked up, startled, then transfixed. For a long moment, he watched the barn, saw the old Mustang's silhouette framed in the open window, ears cocked toward the trees. Ethan stood, letting the cigarette fall and die on the hard-packed earth. His movements were slow, uncertain. Something about the night had changed, something vast and impossible to name. Seemed to stand just behind the curtain of darkness. He walked out into the yard, his feet silent on the dew-damp grass, heart thudding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He stopped a few feet from the barn, just close enough to see Rusty's outline, motionless and regal in the moonlight. The horse never looked at him, but continued to watch, the woods muscles taut, waiting. "What do you see, Rusty?" Ethan whispered into the dark, his words swallowed up by the hush. "What are you looking for?" He felt all at once very small, like a child, alone in church, standing before some altar that demanded humility. As if in answer, Rusty turned his head and eyes locking with Ethan's. The look wasn't angry or frightened. Instead, it was impossibly deep, full of something Ethan could not begin to describe. It was the look of a being that had judged him, not with anger, but with a grace that made forgiveness seem unbearable. Ethan swallowed hard. He felt his own barriers weaken, felt the hard shell around his heart start to crack. "You knew I was wrong, and still you stepped in," he murmured, voice rough. "Why did you save her?" Rusty took a step forward. He did not touch Ethan, did not nuzzle or demand attention. He simply stood beside him, silent, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from his body. In the space between them, something holy hovered, something neither animal nor human, a quiet pact made without words. Ethan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion that had no name. He felt small, but also for the first time in years, not entirely alone. On the porch, Grace watched the scene unfold, her body a shadow in the doorway. She made no move to interrupt, no attempt to call her son back inside. Instead, she folded her hands over her heart and bowed her head, offering up a prayer she didn't know how to speak. She let the moment belong to them, to her son and the Mustang who had saved her, both standing together in the sacred hush of the night. Ethan drew a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping. He stepped back just a little, putting distance between himself and the horse. He didn't cry. He didn't speak again. But when he turned toward the house, his eyes were changed, softer, the old storm passing at last. He slipped inside without a word, moving quietly down the hall. When he reached his room, he lay down on the narrow bed, letting his head sink into the thin pillow. For the first time since coming home, his mind did not race. He did not see the nightmares that usually waited behind his eyelids. Instead, he felt the night wrap around him like a benediction and drifted into sleep. Outside, the ranch was silent once more. The moon sailed higher. Rusty returned to his stall, lowering himself to the straw, still and peaceful, as if standing guard over all the restless hearts within. And Grace remained on the porch, breathing in the night, grateful for the mercy that sometimes comes not as words, but as the quiet presence of something steadfast, something strong enough to stand in the darkness and hold the light. Dawn came slowly to Walker Hollow Ranch, smothered in mist and heaviness. The light was thin, a diluted silver, and it pooled on every blade of grass, gathering in the creases of the land and turning the world pale and quiet. Fog wrapped the fences and the roof lines, hiding the mountains beyond, and the air hung wet and heavy as a blanket soaked with memories. Ethan was up before anyone else. Sleep had come to him only in snatches, each time breaking apart before it could comfort. He wandered the kitchen in silence, made himself a cup of the strongest coffee he could muster, then left the mug untouched on the windowsill as he shrugged into his coat and boots. He crossed the yard in the muffled light, the dew soaking his cuffs and weighing down every step. Rusty greeted him at the fence, breath clouding in the cool air. And for a moment, Ethan simply stood there, hand buried in the horse's mane, taking comfort in the animal's solid, wordless presence. Together, they walked a slow circuit of the field, Rusty keeping close, as if he sensed his companion's need for company. When they reached the edge of the back pasture, Ethan paused beneath the old pine. Here, the land sloped down into a little hollow, and in the center of that hollow stood a simple wooden cross. It was rough handmade, the name Frank Walker, carved with an old hunting knife and stained by time and weather. Ethan had visited the place thousands of times, first as a child hiding from his parents' arguments, later as a teenager nursing a broken heart, then as a young man searching for meaning in the things his father had left unsaid. This morning, something was different. The cross was tilted, half-toppled, the base muddy and loose. The earth around it had been torn up, tufts of grass lying flat as if pawed by restless hooves or turned by wind and rain. Ethan stopped, a cold spike settling in his chest. He knelt, setting Rusty's reins down, and tried to right the cross. But his hands, calloused and steady in every other moment, now trembled so much the wood slipped and nearly fell again. He pressed it back into the soil, the gesture at once an act of repair and apology. But it didn't help the feeling building inside him, a cocktail of unease, anger, and something else. Something that hovered at the edge of words like a warning he couldn't decipher. Was it just the storm last night? Or was this the universe? Or maybe God nudging him toward a truth he'd tried so long to avoid? He lingered there a moment longer, then gathered himself, called Rusty back to heel, and started the slow walk toward the house. When he entered the kitchen, Grace was already awake, standing at the counter in her faded robe, back turned to the room. She poured coffee into a chipped mug, her posture stiff but controlled. The silence in the room was dense, carrying all the weight of last night's ghosts. Ethan set his hat on the table. He didn't clear his throat, didn't offer a greeting. He just let the question drop heavy and unadorned. "Did you see the cross this morning? The one for Dad?" Grace didn't turn. The wind was bad last night. Must have knocked it loose. Ethan's voice was calm, but the edge was sharp as an old fence wire. "It's not the wind that bothers me, Mom. It's you." She turned then the mug halfway to her lips, pausing as if the simple act of drinking had become suddenly impossible. Ethan watched her, saw the way she gripped the handle, the knuckles turning white. "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" he said. "Why'd you let me believe he just left? Why'd you let me think it was me, that I wasn't enough for him to stay?" His words were not loud, but they pressed hard, cracking the veneer of calm that had settled over the house in the last few hours. Grace put the mug down, slow and careful. She pulled out a chair and sat exhaling, as if the act itself cost her something. For a long time she said nothing, eyes fixed on the faded tablecloth. Then, in a voice thin with weariness, she answered, "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd hate the whole world. And you'd hate me too." She sat back, the years dragging at her shoulders. Ethan could see her struggling, not with anger now, but with a pain deeper and older than he could remember. She started to speak, then stopped, swallowing hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "When I was 30, she said, her voice distant, "I'd just come back from the war for the first time. I wanted to believe that meant something, that I could start over. But your dad, Frank, he changed. The drinking got worse. He lost his job. There were debts I never even knew about until they came to take the truck." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. "One night after too many drinks, he hit me." She didn't look up. "I thought I could forgive it. I told myself it was just the booze or the pain or the world being unfair. But then he left. Just like that. Walked out and didn't come back. I had nothing. No money, no job, a ranch full of bills, and you just 3 years old. I pawned my wedding ring for enough cash to buy diapers and formula. The neighbors turned their backs. Only your Aunt Maggie tried to help." She took a shuddering breath, each sentence peeling away a layer of her armor. "When the army opened up enlistment again, I signed up. Not for honor, not for patriotism, but because I needed the paycheck. I needed the barracks. I needed to know you'd have a roof over your head, even if it wasn't under mine." Her voice began to crack, her composure splintering in the morning light. "I left you with Maggie because she was the only one who would take you. I told myself it would only be for a little while, until I could save enough to bring you back. But the years dragged on, and every time I thought I was close, something would pull me under again." She looked up then, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time. "I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I left because it was the only way I could see to keep you alive and keep myself alive too. There were nights I wrote you letters, all the things I wished I could say to your face, but I never sent them. I thought if you read them, you'd see how weak I really was. I thought maybe you'd have an easier time hating me than loving me." She fell silent, tears glinting in her eyes, but not falling. Ethan closed his eyes. All his life he'd carried the story that his father had just vanished, that his mother had chosen the world over him. The rage that had once given him purpose now felt brittle, thin as ice at the end of winter. Grace's next words were even softer, spoken almost to herself. "I could have told you the truth. I could have told you that your father didn't just leave, he was lost too. But I was afraid. Afraid you'd grow up filled with nothing but hatred, that you'd see the world as cruel and small and never learn to forgive. So I told you he went away, and then I stopped talking about it altogether. I wanted you to have something good to hold on to, even if it was a lie." She looked at her hands, the veins standing out in the thin morning light. Silence isn't always a way to hide, Ethan. Sometimes it's the only way to let a child keep some piece of their innocence. Ethan turned away, blinking furiously. He didn't want her to see the tears gathering in his eyes, not after so many years spent learning how to keep them hidden. Just then, Jack wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped, sensing the tension in the room, but didn't ask questions. He simply reached out, taking one of Ethan's hands and one of Grace's, as if to tether the adults together by sheer force of childhood. Grace's mouth trembled. She looked at her son, then her grandson, and said, "I never expected you to forgive me, Ethan. I just want you to know, I never stopped thinking of you, not a single day." For a long moment, nobody moved. Ethan sank down onto the floor beside the table, folding himself up with his arms around his knees, head bowed as if in prayer. It was the posture of a boy, not a grown man, a boy who had finally run out of ways to fight. Grace hesitated, then reached over, running her fingers through his hair, gentle and hesitant. The last time she touched him like that, he had been no older than Jack. No words passed between them for a while. The kitchen filled with the slow golden light of morning, and somewhere outside, Rusty let out a low, contented nicker. There was no instant forgiveness, no magic to wipe away the years of hurt. But something shifted, a beginning, not an end. The truth finally spoken lay between them like a seed pressed into good earth. There would be more storms, more reckonings, but the soil was ready. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something other than emptiness. It wasn't relief exactly, or even hope. But it was the start of something he hadn't dared to want, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he and his mother could learn how to heal together. He rested his head against Grace's hand, letting himself be small again, if only for a moment. And in the quiet kitchen, as the day began in earnest, outside the long journey back to each other, truly began. The afternoon sun hovered directly overhead, casting short, sharp shadows across the pasture. The whole ranch felt suspended in a hush, broken only by the soft cluck of chickens foraging beneath the trees and the rhythmic whine of wind through the weathered fence rails. It was a different silence from the tense, brittle hush of earlier days, softer, less charged. Here was the peace of simple work of two generations, standing side by side, surrounded by old boards and the forgiving light of Tennessee summer. Ethan knelt in the patchy grass beside the main gate, his shirt dark with sweat, a battered handsaw in his grip. The wood was stubborn, warped with years of sun and rain, but his hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with steady patience. Jack stood nearby, barefoot and intent, passing nails one at a time and bracing each slat like an apprentice carpenter. His tongue poked from the corner of his mouth with concentration. He wore a baseball cap too big for his head, its bill shadowing his serious eyes. Neither spoke for a long while. It was enough just to share the space and the task, Ethan driving the saw back and forth, Jack matching his rhythm by quietly humming a tune only he could hear. If the boy had thoughts about the past week, the shouting, the crying, the wounds old and new, he kept them to himself. But his presence was steady grounding, and Ethan felt a kind of fragile hope each time he looked at his son. Then, as the saw blade hit a knot in the wood, Jack suddenly looked up, eyes searching his father's face. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but clear, every syllable measured with care. "Dad," he said, "if Rusty hadn't gotten in between you and Grandma that day, what do you think would have happened?" Ethan froze. The teeth of the saw caught mid-stroke, rasping against the wood with a shiver. For a moment, he did not look at Jack. He could not. His son's question was not childish, not meant to accuse. Jack's eyes were steady and open, asking not to judge, but to understand the strange, unruly world of grown-ups. The man set the saw aside, and sat back on his heels, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. Sweat cooled on his spine, leaving him chilled even in the noonday heat. He let out a slow breath and then, voice rough, tried to find the truth in words. "I don't know." Jack Ethan admitted, his gaze fixed on a patch of dry weeds by his boot. "I wish I could say I do, but maybe I would have done something I could never take back." He paused, fingers picking at a splinter on his glove. "I was so angry, son. Angry at Grandma, at myself, at everything that ever went wrong in this family. I let all those old hurts and bad memories take over like a storm rolling in that I couldn't stop. I'm not proud of it. Sometimes I wonder, if Rusty hadn't stood between us, maybe you'd never trust me again." He finally looked up, meeting Jack's eyes. In them he saw a depth and solemnity that startled him. It was not fear, but something else, an expectation that the world might break and heal, and that adults must sometimes name their failures out loud. Jack stepped forward, quiet and unhurried, and set his small hand on Ethan's shoulder. The touch was gentle, firm, a reassurance not of forgiveness, but of presence. Ethan felt something inside him give way, not to shame, but to gratitude. Here was his boy, unafraid to look at the darkness and still willing to reach out. For a while, neither spoke. Wind rustled the tops of the oaks, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass and earth. The moment stretched, honest and delicate. Ethan covered Jack's hand with his own, gripping it gently. "I want to make you a promise." Ethan said, his voice steadying. "From today on, I'm going to learn how to be a father. I won't ever be perfect, but I'm done running away when things get hard. I'm here to stay, Jack. For you. For Grandma, for all of us." Jack squeezed his father's hand, listening closely. Ethan went on softer now, "and I'm going to try and forgive Grandma. Not because she was right about everything, but because she never stopped trying to keep us alive, even if it meant making hard choices. Maybe one day you'll see that grown-ups aren't heroes or villains. We're just people doing the best we can, even when it hurts." He swallowed, voice thickening. "If you'll let me, I want to be the kind of dad you can be proud of. Not because I never mess up, but because I keep coming back and trying again." Jack gave a small, sincere smile, a smile that carried the weight of all he'd seen and all he hoped for. He did not promise forgiveness, but neither did he pull away. The faith in that touch, wordless, simple, and whole, brought tears prickling to Ethan's eyes. Across the pasture, beneath the outstretched limbs of an old walnut tree, Rusty stood in the shadow watching. The Mustang's ears flicked, his tail swished gently. There was no sound from him, no whinny or stamp, only the quiet dignity of a guardian who had kept his word. He seemed to nod just once, a grave acknowledgement. Ethan glanced Rusty's way, lifting a hand in silent thanks. The horse lowered his head and turned back to the grass content, to let this family knit itself back together, strand by fragile strand. A soft wind moved through the fence, rattling the dry leaves. In that breeze, Ethan felt the world shift, not all at once, but just enough. The past was still there, full of brokenness and regrets, but here at this battered old fence, with a boy's hand in his own and a horse standing sentry, the first seeds of something better were being planted. Jack knelt beside his father, tucking close, and the two of them sat for a while, listening to the heartbeat of the afternoon. There were still many questions to answer, wounds to tend, and roads to walk. But for this moment, it was enough. The evening settled quietly over Walker Hollow Ranch, pressing its cool blue hush into every crack and rafter of the old house. Supper had come and gone, its warmth a fading memory. Only the faint scent of cornbread and beans lingered in the corners. Grace washed the last plate in the sink hands, steady her thoughts far away. Ethan stood at the counter beside her, rinsing the cups, while Jack knelt by the cast-iron stove, building an elaborate fort from battered blocks. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock above the door, a soft metronome counting out the seconds of this fragile piece. The fire in the kitchen stove had died to embers. Shadows climbed the walls and spilled across the floor. The silence was not tense now, but thick like a heavy blanket drawn over an old wound to let it heal. After the kitchen was cleared, Grace moved with quiet purpose to the writing desk in the living room, its surface dusted by time and the yellow glow of a single lamp. The drawer, locked for years, gave way to her gentle touch. She reached inside and drew out a battered leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn soft edges, frayed one corner, marred by a burn mark, a souvenir of some long-ago mishap, perhaps a memory too. She said nothing as she crossed the room and placed the notebook into Ethan's hands. The gesture itself felt momentous, as if she was placing her very heart, scarred and uncertain, into the arms of the boy she'd lost and the man he'd become. Ethan looked down at the journal, then at his mother. He saw the tremble at the edge of her mouth, the flicker of emotion she tried to contain. "I never was good with words," Grace murmured, her voice almost lost in the hush. "But I could write. So I wrote. Every time you hurt, every time I was afraid, every year I couldn't send a letter, I wrote in here." Ethan took the journal as if it were both weightless and impossibly heavy. Something he could lift with 2 fingers, yet felt the ache of in his chest. The leather was cool under his hand, and the spine cracked and familiar from all the times it had been opened and closed in the dark. He hesitated, then opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside slanted leftward, a little wobbly, but strong and regular, a soldier's discipline pressed into every line. The ink was faded in places, the letters marching across the page in rows that seemed to vibrate with feeling. He read the first lines in a hush. Ethan turned 4 today. He cried for his father. I cried too, but not where he could see me. Ethan asked why I never sang him lullabies. I can't sing, but I recite poetry in my head as I hold him. Maybe he feels that instead. There were entries for holidays, for birthdays missed. Some pages cataloged small joys, a lost tooth, a scraped knee, a muddy game in the creek. Others held only silence dates and a single word alone. His eyes fell on an entry bold and underlined, the ink blurred by the press of a hand. Today, Ethan said, I hate you, Mom. I only cried and he didn't see. I wasn't angry. I was terrified, afraid I'd lost him forever. The writing that followed trembled letters veering off course. If he never comes back, I will keep writing. If he never reads these words, I want him to know even when I failed, I never stopped loving him. Not for a moment. Ethan traced a finger over the page, his hand so much larger than the lines, his heart shrinking down to the size of a lost boy again. He turned another page, found a birthday missed, 10th birthday didn't call, was too afraid. He'd say nothing back. Christmases where she wrote letters and tore them up. Nights of worry, months of distance, the long, slow ache of waiting. He set the journal in his lap, shoulders shaking in the soft lamplight. The room seemed to tilt and close around him. He did not make a sound, no gasp, no broken sob, just a single tear that fell, darkening the page and bleeding into the old ink, erasing nothing but making every word more real. He didn't wipe his eyes. He closed the journal and pressed it to his chest, bowing his head into his hands like a boy praying for comfort in the quiet dark. For a moment, all he could do was breathe and feel the old pain draining out of him, replaced by something rawer, truer. Grace did not approach. She sat in her old chair, gazing out the window at the night that pressed close to the glass. She knew by long experience that there were some wounds that had to be mourned in solitude, that no mother's hand could reach across certain chasms except with time and silent hope. Minutes passed. The house held its breath. Then Ethan stood. The journal still in his arms, he crossed the worn rug, and instead of returning to his usual place, he knelt at his mother's feet and rested his head in her lap. He did not ask for forgiveness, did not even speak the word sorry, but what he said was honest. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not for being angry, for not understanding soon enough how hard you tried." Grace stroked his hair. Her fingers gnarled by time and hard work still remembered the softness of his curls from years ago, the little boy who'd pressed close when the thunder scared him. She held him now, silver hairs threaded through brown, and let her tears fall silent and unremarked, running down her cheek to land in his hair. It was the kind of embrace that might take a lifetime to happen. There was no music, no grand speech, just the hush of two people coming back to each other after circling so many years apart. From the doorway, Jack watched the scene. His young eyes, wise and clear, took in everything. He saw the way his father knelt, the way his grandmother's hands shook, the way something invisible passed between them, a gift he could not name, but knew was precious. Jack didn't speak. He smiled small and private, then turned away, giving the two their moment. He understood somehow that some miracles need only to be witnessed, not interrupted. In the lamplight, the journal glowed softly. On its cover, beneath a haze of scratches and the shadow of a burn, as the words could just be made out. "For Ethan, so you'll never believe I stopped loving you." Night gathered close to the ranch. The clock ticked on, marking the seconds that led away from anger and towards a kind of peace. Ethan and Grace stayed there, silent, lost in the comfort of forgiveness, found not in words, but in touch and tears, in all the years that lay behind, and all those that, if they were lucky, still waited ahead. The wind sighed at the corners of the house, and the stars rose cold and bright over Walker Hollow Ranch. Inside, a family battered and changed, breathed together in the quiet, and for the first time in years, no one was afraid to hope. The afternoon was folding itself into evening golden sunlight, slanting over the red earth of Walker Hollow Ranch and bathing the world in the soft color of honey. Everything felt warm, stretched out, and at peace, a stillness so pure it hummed beneath the surface. Ethan was outside cleaning and storing his tools in the small shed beside the barn. His movements were slow, almost meditative, wiping dust from the old spade, coiling rope, sorting nails into neat little piles. Each task, no matter how small, felt necessary. These days, order and routine soothed him. He glanced up now and then, watching his family scattered across the yard. On the weathered bench beneath the porch, Grace sat with her embroidery, the white linen stretched in a wooden hoop needle flashing in and out with steady, practiced hands. Her silver hair caught the sunlight, and her face wore a look of gentle focus. At her feet, a mug of tea had long gone cold. Jack was near the split-rail fence, gathering rocks and odd bits of wood, his brow furrowed in a builder's concentration. Now and then, he paused to glance over at Rusty, who grazed lazily in the tall grass by the barn. There was a lull, a sort of golden hush that made the world feel untouched by anything, except the soft breath of wind and the low sounds of animals settling in. Suddenly, as if hearing a silent summons, Rusty lifted his head. He didn't neigh, didn't stamp the ground. He simply started to walk slow and deliberate toward the boy at the fence. There was nothing rushed in his steps, only an unhurried certainty. Jack looked up, eyes wide. It was as though he'd been waiting for exactly this moment all day. The boy didn't call out. He just let the piece of wood fall from his hands, wiped his palms on his shorts, and started after the old Mustang. His steps matched Rusty's, light and silent. Grace, glancing up from her stitches, noticed the odd procession. She set her hoop down, pressing her fingertips to her lips, watching as Rusty led Jack away from the familiar, toward something both solemn and unknown. Ethan, halfway through hanging a rake, felt the air change, a charge, a pause in the heart of the world, and stood still, tools forgotten. Together, the horse and child crossed the yard and headed toward the oldest part of the property, the great white oak in the center of the field. Its limbs, thick and sprawling, had shaded generations. Once long ago, Frank Walker had hung a wooden swing from its lowest branch for Ethan. The remnants of the rope were still there, slowly being swallowed by bark. Rusty stopped at the tree and turned in a full slow circle like he was measuring the ground. The late afternoon sun painted everything in long, gentle shadows. For a breathless moment, everything stilled: the birds in the hedge, the breeze in the grass, even the distant creak of the barn. And then Rusty bent his front knees one after the other and knelt. The Mustang's great head lowered until it nearly brushed the earth. His eyes closed and his whole massive frame settled, humble, peaceful, unafraid. He looked in that impossible moment like an animal deep in prayer. Jack stood beside him, heart pounding. He didn't reach out, didn't speak. Something in him knew not to break the quiet. Grace, trembling, rose from her bench. She walked slowly, almost reverently, toward the tree embroidery, forgotten her steps unsteady, but her gaze clear and fixed. Ethan, shovel clattering to the ground, crossed the yard too, his own hands shaking, unsure why his throat felt so tight. The three of them, grandmother, father, and child, gathered around Rusty beneath the old oak. None of them spoke. They didn't even dare whisper. There are silences in life that are not empty, but filled with the pulse of the sacred. This was one. In the golden light, Rusty knelt still and silent, the picture of devotion. For a minute then, two, then three, time lost its meaning. The shadows stretched and the hush thickened. It was as if the horse carried within him some secret bridge between pain and peace, between the broken world and something whole and holy. No one tried to explain it. Jack stood very close, so near he could feel Rusty's breath on his hand. Ethan watched, eyes glistening. Grace pressed a fist to her chest. Each of them in that quiet felt the weight of old wound scars left by war, by anger, by years spent apart, start to loosen and lift. When Rusty finally opened his eyes, his breathing was deep and calm. He pushed himself upright in one slow, careful movement. He didn't shake his mane, didn't make a sound, just breathed out, as if releasing some heavy task. Then he turned his head, looking at each member of the family in turn. Grace first, and in his gaze there was a strange recognition, as if he saw not just her, but all the years she'd struggled and survived. Then Ethan, who met the horse's eyes, and for a heartbeat saw himself reflected there, not as a man lost to anger, but as someone being offered a way back. And finally Jack, who looked up, his own eyes shining with awe. In that look, no words were needed. It was permission, assurance, and benediction all at once. Now it's your turn. The rest is up to you. Grace was the first to bow her head. A tear traced her cheek, but her smile was soft and grateful. Ethan, watching her, understood, and he too dropped his head in quiet respect. Jack saw them both, and though he was only a child, something told him what to do. He crossed his arms over his chest and bowed, small but unshakable. For a few breaths, the world held still. 3 generations each, bearing their own invisible wounds, stood together in silent gratitude. And all the words they could have said, the apologies, the forgiveness, the longing for peace, were spoken in that shared gesture. It was thanks, farewell, and the promise of healing all in one. When they finally looked up, the sunlight was lower, softening the sharp edges of the day. Rusty was already walking away, heading back to the barn with his usual measured, dignified gait. There was no hint of drama in his steps, only the calm of someone who had done what he was called to do. They watched him go, none daring to speak. Jack slipped his hand into Grace's, and Ethan rested his palm on Jack's shoulder. All three felt lighter, emptied out in a good way, as if the burdens they'd carried for so long had finally been set down, at least for now. Later, when night fell, the stars came out, the oak tree would still stand in the center of the yard, and the grass beneath it pressed flat by Rusty's knees. The memory of what had happened there would linger a secret shared between a horse and a family, the kind of magic that refused explanation. For the rest of their days, whenever life grew heavy again, and they would remember the Mustang kneeling in golden light, and each would know in the quiet of their own hearts that there are miracles in this world that don't need words or reasons. Some things are simply given, like grace, like hope, like the healing that comes at last to those who dare to kneel together. The day was gentle, and new sunlight cascading down through the leaves of the old oak like liquid gold. There was a softness to the air, the kind that made even the birds quiet their calls. At Walker Hollow Ranch, peace felt like something earned, not given like a rare guest who might vanish if spoken to too loudly. Beneath the sprawling limbs of the great oak, at the very spot where Rusty had knelt in his mysterious act of devotion, Grace had set a simple wooden table. A red-checked cloth rippled in the light breeze, and on top of it were the makings of a modest meal, thick slices of cornbread crispy at the edges, a plate of cold ham, and a tall glass pitcher of iced tea beaded with drops of condensation. The three generations sat close shoulder to shoulder, as if proximity alone could hold them together. Grace was in the middle, her hands steady as she tore off pieces of cornbread and placed them on the plates beside her, first for Ethan, then for Jack. She moved with a quiet grace, her gestures as tender as the hush of the afternoon. Ethan filled her glass with tea, his own hands less practiced, but somehow careful, almost reverent, as he passed the pitcher. Jack, youngest and yet somehow grown in the past weeks, tried to spear lettuce onto his fork and failed, then tried again without frustration. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed. Even the breeze seemed to take its time, ruffling Jack's hair, swirling through Grace's skirt, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and new grass. Across the yard, Rusty watched from the open barn gate, his head resting on the top rail. He didn't graze. He simply stood, sentinel eyes half-lidded, as if nothing could tempt him from the quiet unfolding of this new chapter. Lunch was not just a meal, but a ritual, every bite an act of gratitude, every sip of tea a silent promise. We are here together, in spite of all the hurt, all the distance, all the years that nearly broke us apart. Grace glanced at each of them in turn, her chest full. Ethan looked at Jack, a small, hopeful smile lingering on his lips. Even Jack, who once squirmed at every mealtime, sat still content. It didn't take long for the story to drift out into the world, carried by the unseen currents of a small town. A few days later, the grocer leaned across her counter to whisper to a customer, "Did you hear about that old Mustang, Rusty, the one who threw himself between a mother and her angry son?" Then knelt down right in front of them, like he was saying a prayer. At the church social, the priest shook his head. "I don't know if I believe it," he told the deacon, "but there's something to be said for miracles, especially when they happen quietly." The tale echoed from the gas station to the bakery, from the pews to the Sunday farmers' meeting. No one ever told it quite the same way. Sometimes Rusty was just a horse, sometimes he was something more, but everyone repeated the same line. That horse, he chose love instead of just standing by. It became, for a little while, a kind of gentle legend. One crisp afternoon, Jack sat on the edge of the playground at school, munching his sandwich in the sun. A new kid recently arrived from Michigan watched him from a distance, then sidled closer, curiosity winning out. "Hey, Jack," the boy asked, "is Rusty your horse? I heard he's like famous." Can he do tricks or something? Jack paused, sandwich halfway to his mouth. The sunlight caught his face and made him look older, thoughtful in a way that surprised even himself. He shook his head, a soft smile on his lips. Rusty's not that kind of horse, he said simply. He's the horse who stood between anger and love, and he saved my whole family. The other kids fell silent. There was nothing else to say. The answer was whole enough. Later that day, Jack's teacher called Grace and Ethan. She sounded almost shy, as if relaying something sacred. I just wanted to let you know. Jack spoke about Rusty today. He told his class what happened. The way he said it, it was almost reverent. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the barn where Rusty was napping in the sun. He really said that, Ethan asked softly. He did, the teacher replied. And he meant it. Ethan smiled a little amazed. That boy understands more than I ever did at his age. Maybe more than I do now. As evening deepened, Ethan led Rusty out to the open field, unclipping his halter and letting him wander where he pleased. The Mustang strolled nose down, savoring every blade of grass and patch of clover. When he reached the base of the old oak, he stopped and looked back. Ethan followed, dropping down beside him in the soft grass. He didn't speak, there was no need. He simply placed a hand on Rusty's warm, broad shoulder and sat watching the last of the sun fade from gold to amber. From the porch, Grace and Jack watched, too careful not to disturb. In the hush, all three humans knew that the ranch was whole again. Not perfect, not healed overnight, but alive in a way that was deeper and quieter than happiness. Rusty lowered himself to the ground, folding his legs beneath him, and then stretched out on his side. He let the sun warm his old bones, eyes fluttering shut. If a horse could smile, it would look like this peaceful content, dreaming perhaps of the wild hills of his youth or of a family he'd chosen to love. As dusk settled, Grace squeezed Jack's hand and whispered, "Let's let them be, sweetheart." They turned away, leaving Ethan and Rusty beneath the old tree together in the lengthening shadows. In that quiet that the story of Walker Hollow Ranch found its gentle end. Love, when it stands between the past and the future, can do more than heal it. Can make miracles linger in the sun, in a horse's breath, in the memory of three hearts learning how to belong again.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.